The perfect MMORPG is an elusive thing. We're all searching for it, we're all longing for it. That game that allows us to invest thousands of hours into it, that keeps us coming back for more. But what does the perfect MMORPG look like? And more specifically, what should the perfect MMORPG look like? That is what we are here to discuss today. Before we do though, I am genuinely curious what all of you think the perfect MMORPG should be. So if you have a minute, go down into the comment section below and tell everyone. We have a community of MMO players that are watching, many of which consist of current and upcoming developers, publishers, and game designers. So let your voice be heard. To me, the perfect MMORPG is something that I can play every day, or that I can opt to play every other day if I just do not have the time. A game that doesn't necessarily force you to play without ceasing. Something that really bothers me about current MMOs is that if you miss a day or you miss a week, you fall behind. If you fall behind, you can't catch up. And if you can't catch up, people will be less inclined to invite you to participate in content, meaning you fall even further behind. Speaking of, the whole falling behind aspect of the genre is a concern that I know a lot of people find issue with, and that is largely to do with both daily content and RNG. Earning a type of currency by running daily content rewards players for playing every single day, which is fine. But this punishes you for wanting to do something else. RNG drops, RNG stats on gear, that is one of the worst features in modern MMOs. I know not everyone is going to agree with me here, but I hate playing, as an example here, DPS, seeing that piece of armor that I have been grinding for drop and then realizing after celebrating that instead of plus crit or plus damage, it comes with a plus dodge percentage increase. So instead of that piece of gear being best in slot for me, it turns out to be trash. It's useless in competitive play, and if there's no reroll function in game, then you're stuck continuing your grind. I know games like Final Fantasy XIV don't necessarily have RNG stats on gear, but they have RNG drops. And if you're as unlucky as I am, you're going to be required to grind significantly longer and purchase the gear via whatever in-game currency is available at the time. I feel like RNG gives you a very specific rush, a level of satisfaction when you obtain the item that you've been grinding for, but the opposite is also true. Grinding is a part of every game. Almost every activity requires a level of grinding. You grind XP to level your character. You grind reputation to positively impact your relationship with various different factions. You grind dungeons or raids for gear. You grind other players for, well, satisfaction, typically. And don't take that out of context. By satisfaction, I mean the satisfaction you get from beating them up against them, by defeating them in player versus player combat. When you engage another player and you come out on top. Oh, okay. You know what? No matter how hard I attempt to phrase this, it just feels wrong. Now, a game definitely shouldn't be all about the grind, but I feel like as the genre has continued to evolve, player mentality has changed, and not for the better. These days, players are obsessed with instant gratification. That's why MOBAs and battle royales are as popular as they are. They allow for you to jump directly into a game at the same point as every other player present. You're not put days, you're not put weeks behind. However, I feel like, to me personally, the journey through the game is such an enthralling aspect that is now often overlooked. This is evident by looking at the recent surge in World of Warcraft refugees migrating over to Final Fantasy XIV. Players, streamers, content creators, while a large sum of players have played the game in its traditional format, you cannot deny the number of players purchasing level boosts and subsequently complaining they either don't understand the game or how the game works. MMOs these days, or rather MMO developers these days, don't care about establishing a world filled with rich lore, filled with content. The world of Azeroth, its characters, its setting, they kept me playing through every patch. Not the new raid wings or raid tiers, not the new dungeons, not the new classes or races. Today, in December 2021, the reason I am not enjoying WoW isn't because its raids aren't fun. It isn't because its dungeons aren't fun. It's not due to a lack of new classes or races. The developers have just become so disconnected with what their players want that the game is a hollow shell of what it once was. A new player beginning WoW in 2021 has absolutely no idea what's going on in the world, being thrown from expansion to expansion with leaders changing every expansion, new world-ending threats beginning and then suddenly ending as fast as you were made aware of them. It's a mess. Again, the journey is what drew me to WoW. It's what I feel is necessary to keep me invested in an MMO long term. It's why I never played Black Desert longer than a couple weeks at a time. It's why when new MMOs release, I grow bored. The worlds are uninspired, they're linear. Sure, they're large and open, but there's just nothing in them. Like Astelia, Bless Unleashed, Elion, Swords of Legends Online, PSO2 New Genesis. All of these games suffer from this, and admittedly, suffer from the next point as well. Content, or the lack thereof. One thing a lot of players do not seem to realize is that when an MMO launches, it launches with very limited content. It doesn't have hundreds of hours worth of content to play through, with regular monthly updates scheduled immediately after the launch. When starting a new MMO, you'll find one of the most common complaints is there's nothing to do. Sure, that's partly poor planning on the developers. They should theoretically take the time to create enough content for players to consume at a moderate rate, especially after hitting endgame. And by that same logic, they should once again theoretically have a roadmap, whether public or internal, with content scheduled to release periodically in the short term to keep players playing. There's nothing worse than enjoying aspects of a game, its combat, its graphics, its story, then immediately upon hitting endgame coming to the realization that there's just nothing to do. So naturally you grow bored and you move on to something else. Endgame content is important. It's by far one of the most important parts of the entire game. The leveling process can be slow, it can be arduous, the aesthetic look and feel might be underwhelming, the combat might be incredibly basic, but endgame can make suffering through all of that worth it. I know to a lot of people, the way the world is formatted is important. And by that I mean whether the game is instanced like PSO2 or Soul Worker, if it's open world but utilizes segregated zones like Final Fantasy XIV or Guild Wars 2, or is completely sandbox like Black Desert Online or EVE Online. I'm personally happy with any and all of them, surprisingly. On the one hand, Soul Worker is one of my favorite games. I can't really pinpoint why that is, but I also enjoy games like PSO2, Vindictus, Hobbit MMOs like that work for me. Now, they don't give me the same level of enjoyment as a game like Final Fantasy XIV or Guild Wars 2 or The Elder Scrolls Online would, where you can see players out and about in the same areas that you're in, participating in whatever open world content that they have set out to do, seeing other players, engaging with other players, and furthermore grouping with other players that you find out in the sprawling open world that you're inhabiting currently is a key element of the MMO genre. It's what the massive is in reference to. So while I can find immense enjoyment out of playing every type of MMO realistically, I prefer to be able to have large areas outside of towns or cities where hundreds of players can all participate in content together. Which also brings me to my next point, PvP. PvP is, well, it's kind of hit and miss for me. On the one hand, I am a huge PvPer. I love PvP. I spent years doing Demonic World, Chaos Origin, and various other open PvP maps in Tales of Pirates. I played on a PvP server in Perfect World and in World of Warcraft. I loved the challenge, I loved the danger, and while I've definitely grown out of that as I've continued to age, and I'm 31 now, by the way, which is crazy, as I still get carded for drinks and people leave comments telling me that I look 14 when I'm unshaven. But back on topic, at my age, the type of PvP that I enjoy is what is found in World of Warcraft right now with their War Mode feature. Players can opt to either turn War Mode on or off. They're only toggleable in a main city, meaning that if you turn it on, then begin questing out in the open world, you're asking for fights with the opposite faction. This means that on days that I feel up for heavy faction PvP, I can leave it toggled on, and on others I can simply turn it off and go out into the world and quest at my own leisure. This is especially helpful when you have things to do and don't want to be forced into altercations you otherwise want to avoid. But on the other hand, I haven't found myself ever really wanting to PvP in Final Fantasy XIV, so maybe it's just not as appealing of a feature to me anymore. It's difficult to say. Regardless, I feel as though the feature should be present, not the ability to just toggle it on and off at will anywhere at any time. That makes it way too easy to grief and then hide without suffering any type of repercussion. Rather, you have to weigh the pros and cons of toggling it with war mode, as the only way to turn it off is to once again make it back to one of the few core main cities. I've never been of the opinion that gameplay is a requirement to a good game. It's a crutch at best. It enhances what is already there. A bad MMO is going to continue to be a bad MMO even if it has fun combat. And likewise, a good MMO is still going to be a good MMO just with bad combat, which, means it'll just be a less good MMO. I'm fond of every type of combat as well, full action combat, tab target combat, even combat styles that have abilities set to your WASD keys like Lost Ark. I'm not really picky. To me, the perfect MMO has any type of combat that is done well, that isn't slow and cluttered, that doesn't have you spamming 400 abilities, or on the other side of the spectrum, 4. Although, speaking of limited abilities, class identity and class customization is important. Cookie cutter builds are always going to be present in MMOs. There's no getting around that. The highest level of customization could be presented to players, and players will always min-max by following guides other people make. That small percent difference in damage or heals might make all the difference between being in the top tier of raiders or not. However, at the same time, I recall WoW's old talent trees, where you had a lot of control over how your class was built and would subsequently play. They eventually gutted the customization in favor of the current talent system, which still isn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, but I love class depth. I love being able to adjust a build to better suit me, my playstyle. Just because something works for someone doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for me or for you. I want to be given the opportunity to build my character into a creation that best fits me. Whether it's superior or inferior is entirely up for debate. Back in Perfect World, I pumped a high constitution and high strength build for damage and durability. It allowed for me to, on my Blade Master, which is a DPS, tank dungeons that normal Blade Masters couldn't. In Tales of Pirates, instead of pumping excess agility like most Crusaders went for the increased attack speed, I pumped Constitution, which made it impossible for other Crusaders to ever one-shot me due to my excessively large HP pool. But since I still pumped as much strength as I possibly could, I could always one-shot them. This is something that I miss. This is something that I think needs to come back into play. Stats, skill trees. Give me back that freedom that was taken away to make room for basic casualized classes. And I know people are sitting there right now thinking, community is important as well, Sticks, and I do agree. Having played a lot of Final Fantasy XIV and Guild Wars 2, I have learned how much more fun, less toxic communities are. Sure, at the highest tier of competitive content, you're going to run into a substantial amount of toxicity or elitism, but for someone who no longer pushes competitive content, me, a fun, laid-back, casual community is where it's at. One that doesn't take things too seriously. One where most of the players are helpful. One where people genuinely care about one another as opposed to the cesspool that is competitive PvP games like Fortnite, like League, or Overwatch. And finally, story, a narrative. I know I touched on the whole world thing being important, how the characters found within the game, its setting were all incredibly important. But for me to become fully invested in an MMO, it needs to grip me. It needs to make me care about it, enough where I don't spend most of the game skipping through all the text in a mad rush to hit endgame. Telling a good story is difficult, yet there are games out there that do it exceptionally well. To me, the perfect MMORPG is a game that doesn't punish you for having a life and not having the ability to play every day. It's a game that doesn't leave you unsatisfied due to unlucky drop rates for your specific piece of gear. You have a world that actually takes time to explore and complete, that is gripping, that is enthralling, that grabs a hold of you and keeps you on the edge of your seat as you continue to progress towards endgame. There's enough content to warrant playing up until endgame and then long after reaching it. There are updates released frequently enough for you to never fully drop the game, to always come back. It's a game that allows me to see hundreds of other players out in the world, engaging with it and each other, where you can choose to have an entire PvP experience if that's something that you're into, but you're never forced into it against your will. It's a game with great combat of any type, really, where you can play your class however you want, without feeling like you're an exact replica of every other player, where the community is kind, where the community is helpful, and you can form relationships with other people. It's a game that doesn't exist right now, but maybe will one day. Until then, we have games like Final Fantasy XIV, Guild Wars 2, The Elder Scrolls Online, Black Desert, Star Wars: The Old Republic, and so many more that currently exist and to look forward to fill that void until that day inevitably comes. Or doesn't, and the genre just disappears into obscurity.
Someday soon, I'm gonna make it. Yeah, all hard work's gonna be worth it. Ooh,